This is ChangeMakers with Katie Gore, finding the right solutions for the affordable housing community.
Welcome back to my conversation with ChangeMaker Kelvin Jeremiah, the President and CEO of the Philadelphia Housing Authority. Kelvin, in part one, you laid out several points that really need to be incorporated into the new affordable housing policy initiatives with the next presidential administration. And you also laid out a clear path by which HUD can help. Now, I want to shift gears and talk about the pandemic. COVID has shown how fragile housing and the economy can be. So tell us how things are going in Philadelphia.
Well, COVID has unmasked disparities that exist, the social and economic disparities that exist in so many of our communities. We know that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown families, minority communities across the nation. They are dying at higher levels. They are infected at higher levels. And there are a whole host of reasons for that, of course. And here in Philadelphia, we're no exception. I see families who do not have the means to stay at home. There are the families who are our first responders. They are working at the grocery stores, the supermarket, the gas stations. They are the firefighters, the police officers. They are the ones who are putting themselves and their families at risk every day so that we can continue to enjoy the freedoms that we enjoy. They are the nurses' aides, the family caretaker, the senior caretakers who are there trying to not only make a living, but cannot stay home because they have to provide that essential service. As I mentioned, we serve over 8,000 kids. And during the pandemic, we've seen, because the schools have been closed, the need to provide meals for children whose primary source of nutritious meals were the school lunch programs, for example. And because of that, the closure, we had families who are faced with severe food insecurities. I mentioned to you at the outset, to be in this country that has provided me such opportunity, to be here in the wealthiest country in the world, to read stories about some 50 million of our citizens who are faced with food insecurity, many of whom are children, is heartbreaking. It's disheartening. It has, in some ways, undermined the notion of American exceptionalism that I subscribe to. Because as I said, a life like mine isn't possible anywhere else but here. And having come from that place where I have been hungry, I have suffered malnutrition, and that stems from not having enough food to eat, sometimes not having a meal once a day, maybe 3-4 times a week at most, one meal. And to see what's happening here is really heartbreaking. And so for PHA, we've moved in quickly in making sure that we were securing meals to meet the needs of our families, that no child living in public housing or in a community where we are should face hunger and starvation as a result of this pandemic. And Katie, I can tell you that those 88,000 or so children received over 90,000 meals between the months March through July in response to the school closure. And that was incredibly important to me to ensure that the stability of our resident. PHA implemented an eviction moratorium that will expire in March 2021. We took aggressive action to make sure that happened because we were seeing a lot of pressures on the part of our families who were unable to pay rents and who could face eviction. But we wanted to make sure that in light of the pandemic, that we were not adding to those pressures that the families were facing, whether it's
Right.
food insecurity, other bills that they might have to do, the fact that they had, because they're on the front lines, in some cases, were not able to work, etc. We worked aggressively to make sure that that happened. We moved a lot of our functions online, including rent payment and recertification. We installed hand sanitation stations. We issued reusable cloth masks. About 24,000 cloth masks were distributed to all of our public housing residents. At our senior and multifamily high rises, we engage in deep cleaning at least 3 times a week to ensure that we didn't see the level of community spread that so many of my colleagues in other cities were experiencing. And as a result, we worked very closely with our residents to dispel a lot of the myths about the virus, and they became partners. The resilience of our families, of our residents, all of them, because they took this virus seriously. They adhere to all of the CDC and Department of Health protocols that we shared with them. We met frequently. And so a lot of the credit goes to them. But this pandemic, as serious as it is, has revealed some serious concern about the quality of life that those on the lower socioeconomic ladder faces that we really need to confront as we move forward.
Those organization overhauls that you mentioned and your team's ability to meet the needs of the residents is one thing, but exactly what you just said is these new social revelations about poverty and the condition of the struggle for so many people. I think that there's now a burden on several of us within the affordable housing community
Mhm.
to actually exert some pressure to say, okay, what have we learned and what preventative policies or programs can we put in place for the next time? And, are
Exactly.
you starting to have those discussions with teams at NARO and FADA and even in your city? And what are those discussions looking like?
Well, I think there is a recognition that we need to think critically about policy changes. What are some of the near and long term solutions? What are some of the things that we can do in terms of changing our operations to better reflect the new realities? And a lot of the things that we were doing, we could do as a matter of course in terms of enhancing our operation, moving online, etc. But some of the most systematic thing around the affordable housing agenda. How are we going to, in a meaningful way, lift people up from poverty? How are we going to expand the availability of affordable housing or provide additional support to families who are now in need and now are part of the working poor? I receive, Katie, almost on a daily basis, number of emails from folks who say to me, Mr. Jeremiah, I never thought that I would be receiving social welfare, or that I would need an apartment, or that I would want Section 8. But my husband hasn't worked since the pandemic started. My wife has been out of a job. We have underlying medical conditions, and we desperately need assistance. My landlord is going to be evicting me because we haven't paid rent in 5, 6, 7 months. What resources do you have that you can assist us with? And it is so heartbreaking because often there are none, because we first and foremost cater to those people who are already within our portfolio that we already serve. We haven't expanded the availability at all. And so I think part of that discussion that we're trying to have is to push the next administration to make housing affordability a primary goal, a primary objective. And by that, I mean adequate funding for operating affordable housing. As you know, we've been underfunded for many, many years. Providing adequate funding to support our existing affordable housing development, many of which have aged tremendously and that are in need of significant capital investment, and providing a pathway where we can, and funding where we can add to the availability of affordable housing. And then, as I said, the Biden Harris administration has put forth a really compelling housing agenda that calls for the expansion, if you will, of the housing choice voucher program, in addition to addressing the capital needs. One that would function not unlike SNAP or aid to family with dependent children, where families can receive a housing subsidy on top of whatever additional social welfare benefits that they may qualify for. But all of those things, I think, require some thought. And I think it requires, as I said, the alignment of policies and resources on the part of the city, state, and federal government. But the federal government must step up in some very big ways to address the funding issue that exists currently and to provide a pathway for our expanding housing, affordable housing opportunities, because so many families are so deeply in need. Over 10 million families have been unemployed, facing eviction at the end of this month. Where are they going to go? What are they going to do? The Congress passed the HEROES Act that I am supporting, and I'm hoping that the Senate will act on that and pass it, because the need that exists in the real world is increasing and is self-evident, and it's not unique to the American cities. It's in every corner of this country.
Right.
It's an
Right.
urban issue, it's a rural issue, it's a Midwestern issue, it's a West issue, it's a North issue, it's a South. All over this country, in every neighborhood, families are suffering. And the question becomes, what is the government's role to alleviate that suffering?
And I would even say it's not just a housing issue, it really is an economic policy issue
Economic,
as well.
yes, absolutely.
So, HUD has a platform with a variety of programs that, what we could say are, plug and play ready, which means if you get
Mhm.
the adequate funding, if you get the policies in place, there are several things that, we as housing providers that we could further, that we could make better, that we could expand on, but it's going to be a combination of the things that you just mentioned.
Yeah,
And one of those platforms that's in place that is the Choice Neighborhood Implementation Grant. And
yeah.
I want to put this in context because it really is just a drop in the bucket of what's needed. And it's so
A drop
competitive.
in the
It's
ocean.
a drop in the ocean, exactly. And it's not available to everybody. So it's not like every city is getting this. I want to highlight this because, it's something that's already there. So it needs to be funded, it needs to be expanded, it needs to be available. But I want to give you a chance to actually just talk about how this can be one of the many things that helps redevelop a community, helps
Mhm.
provide more housing, and addresses a small drop in the ocean of capital improvements that are needed. So talk to us about your $30 million Choice Neighborhood Grant that you guys just got.
So, so we have been very fortunate to have been the recipient of two choice implementation grants and two choice planning grants. I think we're probably the only city that has had full successful grants. And as you noted, it really is a drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean, in my view. It still remains insufficient. And Katie, I'm sure you remember those days, those bygone era where, we were able to put together significant housing development projects by having one, maybe two funding sources. Now it requires eight, nine, 10 different funding sources to piece together
Hmm.
to develop a 55 unit development. So gone are those days. It requires now a number of partners. And what the Choice Neighborhood Implementation Grant has done for us is enable us to leverage private, philanthropic, city and state funding. So it now merges, if you will, different funding sources and realigns our policy agenda with the city and state and with HUD. The HUD $30 million grant when leveraged, could actually bring to bear a development budget that could be 4 or 5 times that, which is what we look to do, right? So if you get that $30 million grant, you're eligible for additional points for a low income housing tax credit at the 9% on the state level. You're able to put together CDBG and home funding requests from the city level. You were able to go to the bank to fund public purpose bonds. And that's how we make that happen. The last grant that we received, this I think it was in April of this year, for the Charleswood-Blumberg transformation effort, was one that we were incredibly excited to receive for a neighborhood that has been the poorest neighborhood in the city of Philadelphia. And so we're able to now keep our promise to the neighborhood by developing mixed income community where anyone, regardless of their income, would choose to live. The neighborhood that I am speaking of used to be the neighborhood, frankly, of last resort. You would only live here if you had no other place to live. And we have, in fact, transformed this neighborhood. And we're doing exactly what I discussed at the outset, which was thinking critically about what are the drivers for families in deciding where they want to live. And to address those drivers, the amenities, the schools, the quality, the crime issue, and systematically addressing all of those things to create, in fact, a choice neighborhood. And so we were doing that. The program leveraged, as I said, a lot of significant public and private dollars to support our locally driven strategies that address struggling neighborhoods with distressed public and HUD assisted housing throughout. We were able to demolish the high rise that existed there, that was a haven for crime in a community where the indices of social pathology rather, were at heightened levels. And so it goes far beyond construction of affordable housing. In the past, we've built low-income housing, but didn't consider, a lot of the kind of resident-driven support services, and that's a primary focus. And it's why so many, frankly, affordable housing developments fail and were unsustainable because they didn't have the necessary supports that created a community of choice.
So, one last question as we've been reflecting here. What would you say is your vision for the next several years?
Oh my goodness. That's a great question. I think significantly impacting the waiting list is part of that vision. And to do so effectively, as I mentioned, really does require greater advocacy on the federal, state, and city levels to make affordable housing and housing affordability a primary objective. It's something that we must address. Secondly, making sure that we put the agency on a strong financial footing, that we continue the strong financial footing that we're on, so as to have the resources to preserve our aging housing stock. And then I think thirdly is to recognize that housing is health, that housing provides that platform where so many of the other things, the social ills that exist, could be addressed, whether we're talking about unemployment, health outcomes, educational outcomes, that all of those things, if we have stable housing, we have better outcomes around them. And making sure that we're investing in our families. I came into housing initially thinking that we would only be providing and advancing our agenda in a singular focus, which meant for me, let's have just housing. But Katie, as you well know, the state of our families who are in affordable housing developments across the city and frankly across the country requires that we do a whole lot more. And if we are going to address the poverty question, if we are going to address the disparities that you and I know all too well that exist, I think we have to think critically about how we do so and recognizing as I mentioned, that housing is health, and that housing, good quality housing, can provide a platform where so many other things can jump off from. And that's, I think, is the real challenge. We're dealing with a very vulnerable population who are always at risk, and how best do we protect them? I am hopeful, though, that given the new administration's housing agenda, that there are programs that are being contemplated, and there are professionals who are going to be around the table advising this new administration and advising HUD about how we can align federal resources, not just at HUD, but at the Department of Agriculture with regard to food insecurity, Department of Health and Human Services regarding the health disparities that we see that have become so real as a result of the pandemic. The Education Department, where we are now realizing that because so many of our families are disconnected from the internet, that their access to virtual learning resources are limited. How are we going to put them on the same footing like those children who are not in affordable housing environments? I would love to see the alignment of how we are serving people to get the maximum outcome that lift people up and out of poverty. And I think it requires all hands on deck.
And I would even add 3 more agencies to your list, being USDA for rural housing
Yep. Yep.
and the VA for veterans housing. And
Absolutely. I didn't
I
mean
would
to
even
omit
add
them.
right, I would add the EPA because there
Yes.
are, as I have traveled to so many and I have worked in so many different affordable housing communities, there's still a lot of environmental issues associated with
Mhm.
properties that are in proximity to a lot of our developments. So the
Yes.
list goes on, definitely. Well, we have a lot of work that remains to be done. And so I think that I appreciate your words here, but more than that, it has been such a pleasure to share you with our podcast listeners, to hear about your passions, your success, all the great things that are happening in Philadelphia. But you've really challenged a lot of us as practitioners or, people within our communities to really want more for our own community, for the people we know, for so many individuals who are on those waiting lists that deserve to be served and who are vital to our communities. So you have done an excellent job, and our to-do list is long here. Thank
Yes.
you for your
Yes.
time, and I appreciate it.
No, thank you, Katie, for having me. It's a real pleasure. Anytime you want to talk, I'm here.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Changemakers with Katie Gore. To find out more about Katie, go to quadel.com. That's QUADEL.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.